Even though he said he was through with mass events for the evening, the first subject Seth touched upon now, my dream of early yesterday morning, certainly was related to statements he had made just before break, like this one. When you enter time in physical life, you are already aware of its conditions. I think my dream is an excellent example of that philosophy. I discussed the dream with Jane yesterday and intended to ask Seth to comment upon it this evening, if he didn't voluntarily do so. I'm not claiming the dream inspired his material for tonight's session or that I was precognitive in that I'd picked up on his subject matter for tonight and constructed the dream around a portion of it in order to give myself that particular information. Let me shut the door. Perhaps I should have questioned Seth about such possibilities, but their implications escaped me while he was speaking, and I was busy taking notes from my dream notebook with age data about all involved added for the reader's convenience. Dream, Tuesday morning, March 7th, 1978. Very vivid and in color as usual. I dreamed that I was in the kitchen of our hill house in Elmira, preparing to go outside into the backyard. My mother, who died 5 years ago at the age of 81, was with me. She was of an indeterminate age in the dream, as I was, and I believe she was telling me what to expect out there. However, I also knew what to expect. Out on the grass, I saw them, my deceased father and his mother. My father had also been 81 at the time of his death 7 years ago. I estimate that his very elderly mother had died in 1926 when I was 7 years old. I'm almost 59 now. A very unusual dream. My father and his mother were waiting for me. The strange thing was that grandmother Butts looked considerably younger than her son, my father. She was in her late 30s or early 40s, a beautiful woman with straight brown hair and striking blue-green eyes that had a strong magnetic quality. Now, my grandmother was on her knees, kneeling upright in the grass. I dropped to my knees before her. We greeted each other like old friends, wrapping our arms around one another as we talked, and kissed very animatedly. We were so pleased to see each other. I remember my father's legs as he stood beside us. He was more shadowy all through the dream, however not nearly as substantial and real as his mother was. Nor did I see my own mother, his wife, much more clearly. All of us were talking constantly, but I don't remember what any of us said, except that our meeting marked a joyous occasion. I don't recall having had any other dreams of this kind. I woke up as it ended, or faded out of my perception, with the certain feeling that it represented something quite unusual. Jane was sleepily stirring beside me, and I told her I'd had quite a dream. I described it in detail for her when we got up at about 7 a.m. Now here's what Seth had to say about the dream right after break ended. In your terms, your father's mother is ready to enter time again. Your father was pointing you out to her and acquainting her with other such living members of the family as well, who are still in time. Many individuals do this psychologically, becoming aware of relatives still living, even though in life they may never meet. You may feel alone in life if all of your relatives are dead, for example. In the same way, entering life, you often assure yourself that past friends or relatives are there before you. The dream suggests numerous subjects that Seth didn't go into and that I'd leave for the reader to consider. Reincarnation, the shifting of ages, and the independence of memory from time in the dream state, and so forth. I do have a very clear, conscious memories of Grandmother Butts. The last time I saw her, she was ill, a few months before her death, 52 years ago. Yet, strangely, I can consciously accept that my grandmother passed away more than half a century ago easier than I can face the fact that my own father and mother have already been dead for 7 and 5 years, respectively. Now we'll go to the next session. Session 827. In this noon's mail, Jane received from her editor, Tarn Mossman, an early printer's proof of the book jacket for the after-death journal of an American philosopher, The World Views of William James. This is the first time we've seen the design, and we like it very much. The long title, along with Jane's name and introduction by Seth, are well arranged in subtle pastel colors against a deep blue background. However, this proof doesn't contain the copy that Tarn will prepare for the inside flaps and the back of the jacket. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. A potpourri. Heredity plays far less a part in the so-called formation of character than is generally supposed. For that matter, the same is true of environment, as it is usually understood. Your cultural beliefs predispose you to interpret experience in terms of heredity and environment, however, so that you focus primarily upon them as prime causes of behavior. This in turn results in much more structured experience than necessary. You do not concentrate upon the exceptions, the children who do not seem to fit the patterns of their families or environments. So, of course, no attempts are made to view those kinds of unofficial behavior. Because of this, large organized patterns behind human activity often escape your notice almost completely. You read constantly of people who seem to have been most affected by fictional characters, for example, or by personalities from the past, or by complete strangers, more than they have been affected by their own families. Such situations are considered oddities. The human personality is far more open to all kinds of stimuli than is supposed. If information is thought to come to the self only through physical means, then of course heredity and environment must be seen behind human motivation. When you realize that the personality can and does have access to other kinds of information than physical, then you must begin to wonder what effects those data have on the formation of character and individual growth. Children do already possess character at birth, and the entire probable intent of their lives exists then as surely as does the probable plan for the adult body they will later possess. Consciousness forms the genes, and not the other way around, and the about-to-be-born infant is the agency that adds new material through the chromosomal structure. The child is from birth far more aware of all kinds of physical events than is realized also. But besides that, the child uses the early years to explore, partially in the dream state, other kinds of material that suit its own fancies and intents, and it constantly receives a stream of information that is not at all dependent upon its heredity or environment. On these other levels, the child knows, for example, of its contemporaries born at about the same time. Each person's individual life plan fits in somewhere with that of his or her contemporaries. Those plans are communicated one to the other, and probabilities instantly are set into motion in Framework 2. To some degree or another, calculations are made so that, for instance, individual A will meet individual B at a marketplace 30 years later, if this fits in with the intents of both parties. There will be certain cornerstone encounters in each person's life that are set up as strong probabilities or as plans to be grown into. There are bodies of events, then, that in a certain fashion you will materialize almost in the same way that you will materialize your own adult body from the structure of the fetus. In those terms, the body works with physical properties, though again these properties are discussed often, have their own consciousness and realities. Your mental life deals with psychological events, obviously, But beneath so-called normal awareness, the child grows toward the mental body of events that will compose his or her life. Those unique intents that characterize each individual exist in Framework 2, then, and with birth these intents immediately begin to impress the physical world of Framework 1. Each child's birth changes the world, obviously, for it sets up an instant psychological momentum that begins to affect action in Framework 1 and Framework 2 alike. A child may be born with a strong talent for music, for example. Say the child is unusually gifted. Before he or she is old enough to begin any kind of training, he will know on other levels the probable direction that music will take during his lifetime. He will be acquainted in the dream state with other young budding musicians, though they are infants also. Again, probabilities will be set into motion so that each child's intent reaches out. There is great flexibility, however, and according to individual purposes, many such children will also be acquainted with music of the past. To one extent or another, this applies to every field of endeavor as each person adds to the world scene, and as the intents of each individual, added to those of each other person alive, multiply, so that the fulfillment of the individual results in the accomplishments of your world. And the lack of fulfillment, of course, produces those lacks that are also so apparent. Give us a moment. Some readers have brothers or sisters or both. Others are only children. Your ideas of individuality hamper you to a large extent. To one extent or another, again, each portion of consciousness, while itself, contains the potentials of all consciousness. Your private information about the world is not nearly as private as you suppose, therefore, for behind the experience of any one event, each of you possesses information pertaining to other dimensions of that same event that you do not ordinarily perceive. If you are involved in any kind of mass happening, from a concert to an avalanche, you are aware on other levels of all of the actions leading to that specific participation. If buildings are constructed of bricks quite visibly, so mass events are formed by many small, invisible happenings, each, however, fitting together quite precisely in a kind of psychological masonry, in which each of you has a mental hand. This applies to mass conversions and to natural disasters alike. End of dictation. That was dictation. As he progressed with his session, I began hoping that Seth meant it for mass events. Finally, I decided to insert it in the book, even if he didn't. The following isn't dictation, of course, but concerns instead a very vivid dream Jane had the day before yesterday, and Seth's interpretation of it this evening. We're presenting that dream material here because it contains elements of general interest and covers points some readers have touched upon in their letters to Jane. Jane's dream made me a little envious, even if an element of fear might be involved in such an event, since I don't recall ever having had one like this. She wrote, Dream, Saturday afternoon. I took a nap and awakened remembering this dream experience. First I was in a room asking a group of people about the council. I wanted to know if there was such a thing. Instantly a white light came from the floor, up through the ceiling, door width, with some symbols in it or on it. I immediately whooshed up through the air into it, ascending out of the room at great speed. I became somewhat frightened and wished to return. I think I was afraid of being carried away too completely. I don't know what I saw. I returned to the room at once, but forgot how or the circumstances. Later, I'm in some kind of spiritualistic reading room, telling a woman of my experience. When I say I am the author of the Seth material, she becomes upset, saying that they don't accept it. This doesn't bother me. Now, from Seth. Rupert, I understand, was looking for the council. He was looking for counsel of a most exalted kind, and so it became the counsel. An excellent term, by the way, standing for the most intimate and yet exalted counsel possible for any individual. He was looking for a state of higher consciousness that would represent a unique and yet universal source of information and revelation. Such a source does exist for each individual, regardless of how it is interpreted. The white light is characteristically a symbol in such cases. He could not assimilate the information and became frightened, to some extent at least, as at the vastness of the experience involved, as if the ancient yet new knowledge that he sought for his individual reasons was so encompassing that his own individuality would have trouble handling it while retaining its own necessary frame of reference. A natural enough reaction, simply because of the usual unfamiliarity of such experience. He was bathed in that light, however, filled with it, refreshed by it, and given new comprehension that will now emerge in his experience in a piecemeal fashion that can be assimilated in his normal frame of reference. Translations then are even now being made. The contact will also be reestablished. After taking several minutes to cover some other material for Jane, Seth said good night at 11:10 p.m. I guess I'll read this part, but I need to make it bigger. Notes, session 827. Speaking of books, even with all the help Jane has given me lately on Psyche and Volume 2 of Unknown Reality, I'm still only too conscious of the work I have to do to finish the notes and other material for both books and put together their manuscripts for the publisher. I often discover the overall commitment or plan lingering in my mind on a distant conscious level, a pressure toward accomplishment that seems bound to accompany these long-range projects. At times, this feeling can beset me, and I may find myself trying to estimate the number of weeks it'll take me to finish Volume 2 first, then Psyche. But naturally, I told Jane recently again, I choose to become involved with the whole Seth phenomena in the most intimate ways. I did so because I knew from its very beginning that this process of discovery with Seth was more than worth it. I still think so. I added that I certainly chose to do the same thing again, and that I hope to stay involved with the Seth books indefinitely, granted that Seth's material may only be bringing into our conscious awareness knowledge we already possess and use on other levels. Still, it's a fine thing that his material makes us aware of that inner comprehension, and so new dimensions of consciousness become available to us. I drew a rough analogy with painting, to make a pun. The artist may start working on a blank canvas, yet each physical brushstroke he or she delineates is built upon inner knowledge and experience. In the paintings, these qualities are objectified in new combinations, which in turn add further to the artist's conscious comprehension. And when the painting is finished, the artist contemplates a new reality of his or her own creation. I mailed the first chapter of Emir to Prentice Hall just a month ago. I'm going to skip some of this and get back down to where Seth is speaking. Looks like they skipped 134, then it goes to page 135, but I'll read this last part right here. Seth's material on individual creativity at once reminded me of a certain passage of his in the private or deleted portion of the 580th session of April. I came across it recently while looking for some other references he'd made to Jane or Rupert. The regular part of the 580th session, incidentally, was for a book 2, Chapter 20 of Seth Speaks. I like the following quotation so much that I've made copies of it for us to keep where we can refer to them. In my case, pinned up on a wall in my studio. This little something is a typical example of how something good can get lost in the constant growing mass of Seth material. Even with our attempts at indexing, it's very difficult to keep track of single paragraphs like that. Rupert is, as you know, highly creative. What most artists do not recognize is that the self is the first creation. They do not think of themselves as products of their own creativity. Because of Rupert's energy and creativity, he has always perfectly mirrored, and even somewhat exaggerated, the condition of the inner self, its activities, and inner postures. Obviously, then, Seth's observation doesn't apply to people in the arts alone, but to everyone. Session 828. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, in your terms, speaking more or less historically, early man was in a more conscious relationship with Framework 2 than you are now. As Rupert mentioned in Psychic Politics, there are many gradations of consciousness. And as I mentioned in The Nature of the Psyche, early man used his consciousness in other ways than those you are familiar with. He often perceived what you would call the products of the imagination as sense data, for example, more or less objectified in the physical world. The imagination has always dealt with creativity, and as man began to settle upon a kind of consciousness that dealt with cause and effect, he no longer physically perceived the products of his imagination directly in the old manner. He realized in those earlier times that illness, for instance, was initially as much the result of the imagination as health was, for he experienced far more directly the brilliant character of his own imagination. The lines between imaginative and physical experience have blurred for you, and of course, truly, have also become tempered by other beliefs and the experiences that those beliefs then engender. I am putting this very simple here. It is far more complicated, and yet early man, for example, became aware of the fact that no man was injured without that event first being imagined to one extent or another. Therefore, imagined healings were utilized, in which a physical illness was imaginatively cured, and in those days the cures worked. Regardless of your histories, those early men and women were quite healthy. They had strong teeth and bones. They dealt with the physical world through the purposeful use of the imagination, however, in a way now most difficult to understand. They realized they were mortal and must die, but their greater awareness of Framework 2 allowed them a larger identification, so they understood that death was not only a natural necessity, but also an opportunity for other kinds of experience and development. They felt their relationship with nature acutely. Experiencing it in a far different fashion than you do yours. They felt that it was the larger expression of their own moods and temperament, the materialization of self-events that were too vast to be contained within the flesh of any one individual or any group of individuals. They wondered where their thoughts went after they had them, and they imagined that in one way or another those thoughts turned into the birds and rocks, the animals and trees that were themselves ever-changing. They also felt that they were themselves, however, that as humans they were the manifestation of the larger expression of nature that was too splendid to be contained alone within nature's framework, that nature needed them, that is, men, to give it another kind of voice. When men spoke, they spoke for themselves, yet because they felt so a part of the natural environment, they spoke for nature also, and for all of its creatures. Much is not understood in your interpretations. In that world, men knew that nature was balanced. Both animals and men must die. If a man was caught and eaten by animals, as sometimes happened, his fellows did not begrudge that animal its prey, at least not in the deepest of terms. And when they slayed other animals themselves and ate the heart, for example, it was not only to obtain the animals' stout hearts or fearlessness, but also the intent was to preserve those characteristics so that through man's experiences, each animal would continue to live to some extent. Men in those times protected themselves against storms, and yet in the same way they did not begrudge the storm its victims. They simply changed the alliances of their consciousness from the identification of self within the flesh to self within the storm. Man's and nature's intents were largely the same and understood as such. Man did not fear the elements in those early times as it is now supposed. Some of the experiences known by early man would seem quite foreign to you now, yet in certain forms they came down through the centuries. Early man, again, perceived himself as himself, an individual. He felt that nature expressed for him the vast power of his own emotions. He projected himself out into nature, into the heavens, and imagined there were great personified forms that later turned into the gods of Olympus, for example. He was also aware of the life force within nature's smallest parts. However, and before sense data became so standardized, he perceived his own version of those individualized consciousnesses, which much later became the elementals, or small spirits. But above all, he was aware of nature's source. He was filled with wonder at his own consciousness ever newly came into being. He had not yet covered over that process with the kind of smooth continuity that your own consciousness has now achieved. So when he thought a thought, he was filled with curiosity. Where had it come from? His own consciousness, then, was forever a source of delight, its changing qualities as noticeable and apparent as the changing sky. The relative smoothness of your own consciousness, in those terms at least, was gained at the expense of certain other experiences, therefore, that were possible otherwise. You could not live in your present world of time if your consciousness was as playful, curious, and creative as it was for then. Time was also experienced far differently. It may be difficult for you to understand, but the events that you now recognize are as much the result of the realm of the imagination as those experienced by early man when he perceived as real happenings that now you would consider hallucinatory or purely imaginative. It seems quite clear to you that the mass events of nature are completely outside of your domain. You feel you have no part in nature except as you exert control over it through technology, or harm it again through technology. You grant that the weather has an effect upon your moods, but any deeper psychic or psychological connections between you and the elements strikes most of you as quite impossible. Give us a moment. You use terms like being flooded by emotion, however, and in other very intuitive statements showing your own deeper recognition of events that quite escape you when you examine them through reason alone. Man actually courts storms. He seeks them out, for emotionally he understands quite well their part in his own private life and their necessity on a physical level. Through nature's manifestations, particularly through its power, man senses nature's source and his own, and knows that the power can carry him to emotional realizations that are required for his own greater spiritual and psychic development. Death is not an end, but a transformation of consciousness. Nature, with its changing seasons, constantly brings you that message. In that light and with that understanding, nature's disasters do not claim victims. Nature and man together act out their necessary parts in the larger framework of reality. Your concepts about death and nature, however, force you to see a man and nature as adversaries, and also program your experience of such events so that they seem to only confirm what you already believe. As I mentioned earlier, each person caught in either an epidemic, or a natural disaster, will have private reasons for choosing those circumstances. Such conditions also often involve events in which the individual senses a larger identification, however, even sometimes a renewed sense of purpose that makes no sense in ordinary terms. And I will end here before the next session.